Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining my talk. I'm honored to be an invited speaker and want to thank Neuroscience 2021 and Lab Roots for hosting this conference. I want to start with just saying a little bit about myself and my work. I'm a supervising psychologist at Harbor UCLA Medical Center, where I've worked for the last 20 years or so. I'm also the clinical director of the Safe Harbor Trauma Recovery Center team that started in 2019 based on a grant from the California Victim Compensation Board. And I'm excited about doing that work with that team. And I'm also an associate professor at UCLA, Geffen School of Medicine. And some of the work I do focuses, of course, on trauma, but also on adults with chronic mental illness who are also high utilizers of emergency services, and also a population that engages in suicidal behaviors and non-suicidal self-injury. This topic of compassion fatigue is really near and dear to my heart, having been on a team and served in a leadership position where a member of the team did complete a suicide, and this was years ago, but still looming for me to think about and attuning to in any team I work in. What is the responsibility and what are measures of self-care and dealing with compassion fatigue that really helps teams thrive and grow? So I want to start with a quote by Viktor Frankl. That which is to give light must endure burning. And I actually asked my team to reflect on this quote and to give me some experiences from their work and even from their lives on what that means to them. And many really profound messages came in, a lot about a shared journey of recovery. Many people that choose to do trauma work have a lived experience and thinking about the burn that they felt in their life, either through intergenerational trauma or specific traumas they endured that led them to be here and do this work. And I want to share one particular story of a psychologist who's working with a refugee from El Salvador who was really struggling with the attorneys and the asylum procedure and wasn't able to be there for her father's death when he died in El Salvador. Part of it was due to some miscommunication with the attorneys and a letter not being written. And this is what the psychologist wrote. She was angry at the system, at her lawyer, and at me. I felt the burn. I held space for her and her emotion, knowing that her grief was more than two parts. There was a third part of injustice and barriers that she had to face and continues to face as an immigrant who had to flee her home for safety and is navigating the complex waters of feeling acknowledged and legitimate in this new country. We discovered the light in the burn, that her grief was finally labeled, shared, and acknowledged. Warmth and connection were present, but so was the pain. So a little bit about Safe Harbor Trauma Recovery Center, and this is Harbor UCLA. Harbor UCLA has a resilient story of its own, being the first port of embarkation for the Army in 1942. Many of the buildings are still the same buildings from 42 and still standing. And this is our vision for a better, newer facade in the future on the lower picture there. And the trauma team works to promote healing, recovery, and growth for trauma survivors and their families. But we do really more than that. We also combine our efforts with community collaborators, which include law enforcement, a particular organization called Fostering Unity that provides stabilization and care to foster families, resource families, and to also caregivers who are biological caregivers, and to the children. And we're working with another organization, After Innocence, that looks at projects that help parolees that were exonerated. So essentially people who are convicted of crimes unjustly and are exonerated and are reentering the community. And these services really show the vast impact of compassion fatigue, not just for our team, but teams around the county and at Harbor. Another project is with nurses. Nurse suicide is pretty much up there with physician suicide these days. So for physicians, it's the largest group that complete suicide, and followed by nurses. So really thinking of compassion fatigue and how to make some changes through actual interventions using community resilience models and some other models that I'll talk about. So my talk will focus on the effect of COVID-19 specifically, and thinking about more globally about compassion fatigue. We're going to review some stress models that are old and new. We're going to talk about the concepts of compassion fatigue and burnout, and maybe add a reframing, less pathological view of compassion fatigue and burnout. Also think about positive psychology, the new wave, and not just thinking about happiness and well-being, and then Seligman talked about flourishing, but also thinking about the upside of the dark side, negative emotions as well, and leading to mature gratitude, and thinking about how that leads to actual reframe of resilience stories. So generally, in terms of COVID-19 impact, a new study by Kababraka in 2020 showed that 30 to 70% of health workers have depression, anxiety, acute stress disorders. Some suicidal ideation increased to up to 10% as well. And this particular study that I'm naming in my slide is a large survey showing that 7 in 10 health professionals indicated that the pandemic is the most stressful time of their entire professional career. There's always a silver lining. I love this study that when asked about whether you think there are any positives that come out of this pandemic, 88% of the respondents said yes in this 2021 study. Primarily the areas that they described growth in, family relationships, about 50% described that, a greater appreciation for life involving reassessment of personal values, increased spiritual growth for almost 20%, discovering and embracing new opportunities and possibilities. So thinking about there's always another side to adversity and stress. There is the silver lining that you can decide to focus on. So thinking about COVID and the specific impact of COVID that's really new in a modern age is the chronicity of the stress, the social isolation, having unclear prognosis, even now with vaccination and the multiple social media misinformation about it, the confusion and uncertainty about health and health behaviors. Also the imposition of unfamiliar public health measures, and now shelter in place is lifted, but really even negotiating another potential surge and what measures would be instituted again. The pervasiveness of human life that's lost in a modern era where we expect modern medicine to be able to tackle it, and human life is still lost. The unique economic hardships that has an impact on families. So high rates of unemployment, higher rates of domestic violence and child abuse cases, up to about 35% increase in child abuse cases, looking at one international study that looked at Europe, Asia, and the US. Also interesting, there are less ED, emergency department visits in the 2020 year compared to 2019, but there are more visits to the ED by children and women who required hospitalization. So I think the issue here is access rather than actual severity or increase in abuse cases. There are unique there's health disparities as well that are similar to what we know of in terms of people of color. But in terms of the pandemic, it's even more startling to think about and read those health disparities. In some counties in the South, like in Louisiana, for example, 70% of the infections are in African Americans, whereas 30% is African Americans. So 30% of the population constitutes people of color, and specifically African Americans. In the last JAMA study that looked at 131 counties in the US, the death rate from the pandemic is sixfold for African Americans compared to their white citizens, and it's threefold the infection rate. And this is beyond access to care or what people usually name as comorbidities like diabetes or hypertension. But in reality, this is more about race determines home and issues related to people who work in the service industry who don't have the luxury to work from home, housing density, not owning their car or home, and having to make some difficult choices about being out in the world while facing a pandemic. This is really more the issue. And then finally, in terms of doing remote work as mental health professionals and doing virtual therapy, we really thrive on the connection with the client. We thrive on being able to see them and speak to them, sitting in the office, or when we do psychosocial rehabilitation, a sort of community treatment, is even being out in the community and doing field work. And that's not afforded to us anymore at this time. Gradually, we started doing that again and had to go back to the practice of remote work, which makes it very difficult. All right, we're going to move on to stress and describing different types of stress and stress theories. So there's the good, the bad, and the chronic. The good is a stress that you anticipate and decide to take part in, such as jumping off a perfectly good airplane or being pushed off a building. Having done both, I can attest that that's a real thrilling experience. There's a chronic stress in the case of a nurse staff that has extended and has been there for many hours, and this goes on day in, day out. And having an acute stress reaction to some stimuli that's aversive in the moment, such as being chased by a hippo, where in some regions it's the #1 cause of death. The number of different stress theories span from the year of 1932, where Cannon talked about fight, flight, freeze, and then we added Fawn. There's also fornicate, which I'm not talking about today. But I want to focus on tend and befriend, which is a newer theory that was developed by Shelley Taylor out of UCLA. And she presented it first in 2000, and then it was finalized and written about in 2006. And this notion is that tend and befriend is a biobehavioral theory that we can see in animals and also in humans, where the tending to their young, protecting their young, and befriending their social community actually reduces stress at a biological level. So there are several studies that show that having an experience of being learning about the diagnosis of cancer in a loved one and having one group send positive thoughts and wishes for the person diagnosed, and versus a group that's not told to do that. The group that is told to engage in essentially tending and befriending behaviors show a reduction in cortisol levels, both in blood and saliva. Another interesting study is one that involved using a huggable device in a virtual platform. So actually having something you can hug as you're talking to someone else. And the study showed, again, decrease in cortisol level and both blood and saliva in that study. So tending and befriending is an important component. And to kind of drive that home, and you might be wondering, why is there a lioness licking what looks like an antelope and not eating it? And so the next video is actually a story of a lioness in Sub-Sahara that adopted a oryx antelope calf as her own. And this was after she lost her own cub. And her dealing of a stress response is to actually tend and befriend another species altogether.
The unthinkable happened. Word spread that a lioness in Kenya's Samburu Reserve had taken an antelope calf alive and was guarding it as her own.
I couldn't believe my ears when I first heard about the adoption. I just thought, that's absolute nonsense. Give it a few hours and that lioness will definitely eat the calf.
Saba Douglas Hamilton is wildlife conservationist for the Save the Elephant Trust. She rushed to the reserve to see for herself the lioness and a baby oryx antelope in one of the oddest animal bonds ever seen.
And all of a sudden, there was this completely unheard of situation on our hands of a predator that had adopted its prey.
She was named Kamanyak, meaning the Blessed One.
And I think many people felt that this was, had to be a message from God. This was a miracle. This was, the lion and the lamb laying down together. And Kameniak really seemed to be infatuated by the baby. So they'd walk together and lie flop down under a tree and curl up next to each other. It was very moving.
All right, sorry to say there is a grim ending to this story, and probably not what you think. The lioness did not eat the baby antelope. However, after 2 weeks of not being able to approach the watering hole or hunting for food sources, they had to go down, and in the watering hole, a big lion jumped out and ate the baby antelope. And from what I'm remembering the story, she repeated this adoption process with another baby antelope. And I want to think, maybe anthropomorphically thinking about this, that this was her way of befriending to overcome the stress response we were talking about. So I want to talk about stress-related concepts that brings us to the heart of this discussion, which is thinking of burnout, secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, and compassion fatigue. And if you want to think of, the terms here, burnout and secondary trauma are kind of discrete and maybe more potentially global. So there's this discrete of secondary trauma and more global of burnout, but both contribute to more chronic compassion fatigue. And I want to add here that often we think about compassion fatigue and even burnout as pathological. It's what people don't want to experience. I want to suggest to us that there is an adaptive function for feeling compassion fatigue and experiencing it. And this quote comes to mind: "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society," by Jiddu Krishnamurti. And what that speaks to me about is when the system is not fitting and what you're trying to fit into is not working for you. The compassion fatigue is an adaptive response to realizing I need to do something different. This is not working. So rather than thinking about it as symptomatic and pathological, how do we start reframing it to think about it as a warning signal? Something has to change in my life. I need a more value-aligned endeavor. I need to change my priorities. I need to think about more meaning. And so thinking about this quote and thinking about reframing this compassion fatigue idea. So burnout, as defined as a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion that's caused by excessive and prolonged stress. And often we think about role overload, just doing too many things, or having role conflict, trying to be in two places at the same time. Having a young child, age 5 myself, I know that very well. And thinking about how do we intervene. So in hospitals where some measures were utilized, either helping healers heal in H3, which we have at Harbor, or some more precise trainings or more theory and evidence-driven interventions like community resilience model, actually proved really successful. So in one study, there is a reduction of 30% in burnout, and this amounted to over 6,000 fewer infections for a vast annual saving cost, up to 68 million. And the interventions that were used in many of the studies are things typical like H3 or any kind of interventions that teach a person how to come back to a resilient zone, which I'll talk about a little later. Other concepts related to stress and compassion fatigue that contributes to it is discrete vicarious trauma incidents. And that is the process through which the therapist's inner experience is negatively transformed through empathic engagement. And this is the more that you feel the empathy, the more likely you are to be impacted. And the importance I spoke about of integrating and moving through it yourself, as well as your work with the client. And the measures are rather high, 80 to 86%, specifically nurses, social workers, physicians, and therapists of all kinds. First responders essentially are at risk for that based on Figley. So compassion fatigue, which I've been talking about as the umbrella term, thinking about that, is the gradual lessening of compassion over time. And there's stages in it that you can experience going through them. But one thing to mention, there's the sadness that goes along with feeling what you're feeling as an empathic response. In itself is not, again, a pathological response. It's that you allow the experience of another to touch your heart and be present with them. But if you are not aware and you're not intentionally working on separation and mirroring, you go through Figley's ideas through certain stages. In the beginning, it's the zealot phase where you're almost overdoing. You're there extra hours. You're spending hours in the NICU unit holding a preemie, for example, as a nurse. Then you move through irritability with the system, with others, and you slowly withdraw. And then what he calls the zombie phase, where you completely are disconnected, both in your own life, with your own family, and others at work. And this can either stay as a pathology and victimization, or move into a maturation and renewal, depending on this process I'm speaking of. And the key, again, is to acknowledge you're struggling. And the first step is to acknowledge and then ask for help. In this metaphor, by the time you're thirsty, you are already dehydrated. So how do you not get emotionally, psychologically dehydrated with the work you do? There's a famous, cultural narrative, if you will, of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And this quote is actually from Nietzsche, but also has been maybe sung about by Kelly Clarkson and Taylor Swift. And thinking about whether that's true or false, really the answer is it depends. It depends related to how unintegrated the trauma is. If it's unintegrated, they're more susceptible in the sense to die from that at the most extreme, by suicide or prolonged stress that causes other adversities, medical adversities. So this idea of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and even in terms of post-traumatic growth, is really, you need to look at it a little more carefully. What does cause post-traumatic growth isn't incidental self-report, retrospective studies that look at did people report it, but how does it get grounded in a personality factor that now changes? And this is the work, recent work, of Jayawakrami and Blackie, and also Inferna and Jayawakrami, who really talk more about perspective studies to look at what actually leads to post-traumatic growth and what gets it grounded as a personality trait or a personality factor, which is really important to think about when we think of post-traumatic growth. So the concept of neuroplasticity at some point in the 60s was a new one. We used to think of the brain as unchanging or fixed, and it was the work of a researcher by the name of Michael and Mercedich, I think, back in the 60s, who actually sought out to prove it, that the brain is unchanging, and actually discovered the opposite. So think about his resilience in adapting and actually creating this new field of research that actually shows that the brain does change, and neural pathways do actually grow in the adult brain. So not only positive reactions and positive thoughts wire, and what wires together fires together. So the idea of creating more positive from creating positive, also negative emotions wired that way, which kind of explains why many trauma survivors associate, let's say, a smell with a person who abused them, and actually wiring moves into the olfactory lobe in the brain, and so that the memory of the scent actually is a brain response, and the aversion is a brain response as well. So the idea is, if you don't mindfully direct the change in your brain, something else will do it for you. So the idea of really looking at ways to create neural pathways that are creating flourishing, thriving, and resilient stories. So the brain automatically moves to a negativity bias. We have 4 negative thoughts for every 1 positive thought. We look at and scan for threats, uncertainty, social isolation, unfairness, And this could actually impair functioning in life. And I'll use a personal example. I was deathly afraid of sharks. It was a phobia for me. So much so that I would be afraid of them in even fresh water. There are sharks that do survive in fresh water, at least for 60 miles, from what I learned. Those are bull sharks, which are really dangerous for humans. So my rewiring of the brain, some people would call it even systematic desensitization or possibly flooding, I started diving. So here's my first dive experience in Oahu with a turtle, pretty harmless. Then with an octopus, also rather harmless. But then it wasn't my feared object, right? The feared object were sharks. So here I am with bull sharks, specifically bull sharks in Belize. So thinking about rewiring the brain maybe was the catalyst to positive psychology, which is the study of the conditions, processes, and characteristics that contribute to optimal functioning. And one of the things in the old wave of positive psychology is to think about well-being and happiness. And Martin Seligman has revised the idea of happiness and started thinking about flow and flourishing. Actually, flow is from Mihaly. But flourishing is more the term. And now it's developed into another segment of positive psychology where acknowledging and welcoming and integrating the negative, the upside of the dark side idea is really the new wave. But when we used to study happiness, we looked at factors that contribute to it. What's under our control is 40%, our genetics and happiness set point idea, where people just bounce back depending on their genetics, and then life circumstances that limit or provide some obstacles. And we studied this in order to look at how it affects health. And so this is many studies on gratitude and health that looks at sleep, exercise, cardiovascular health, mood, optimism, and many of them show improvement. Cancer and heart attacks, all those are actually studies that looked at how gratitude improves both the prognosis from the disease and maybe a second heart attack if someone is not optimistic. But now we think about something called mature gratitude, which is different than the concept of gratitude we used to think about. And mature gratitude is the dynamic and dialectical interplay between positive and negative life experiences. And the work of Wang primarily highlights the importance of including, incorporating, attending, attuning to negative experiences. Even lingering there in energy psychology, we actually focus on negative images for a while before releasing them. And that idea is actually what we call mature gratitude. So my antidotes to compassion fatigue, one is mindfulness practice, and mindfulness goes a long way. I want to share just a quick story. I was working with someone, a high commanding officer in a particular law enforcement agency who was required to come to therapy and wanted no part of it. And said he's giving me 5 sessions to implement some change in his life. And we started by just doing mindfulness. And the first 3 sessions, it's all we did: observe, describe, participate. What skills of mindfulness? And he came back after the 3rd session. So mindfulness essentially in terms of non-judgmental, present-focused attention, and not running to past or future, and not reacting. And he came back after the 3rd session saying, my life has been transformed. And I was a little skeptical, but he proceeded to tell me a story where he was at the market in line and someone in front of him cut in and he was about to tell her off. It was an older woman with a baby, and then handed the baby to the cashier and had a long conversation, and he was very angry, but then remembered our mindfulness practice. And then when finally it was his turn, he came up to the cashier and he said, it was a very cute baby. And she said, I'm so glad you think so. It's my child, it's my daughter, and I don't get to spend time with her much because I work 2 jobs since my husband died in the last deployment. And he just stopped at his tracks and he actually started crying right in the market And this is a high commanding law enforcement officer. Then came back to session and said how in life he has been on autopilot, reacting and being angry and irritable, and how the mindfulness practice actually helped at least the beginning stage of changing his life. So a daily mindfulness practice. And it doesn't mean sitting and meditating necessarily. It's just engaging in every moment in that non-judgmental way. Value-aligned work daily. And sometimes if your work becomes your life, like I'm working with resource parents, I'm also a resource parent, an adoptive mom of a child. So finding ways where your work and your life actually align so that you're actually living what you're doing at work and it's part of your meaningful life activity. Reframing compassion fatigue from pathology to meaning making, which is what I spoke of before. Creating more social connections, tending and befriending on a daily basis. Holistic view of health, the mature gratitude, thinking about the negative, thinking about your meltdowns as important steps in health and maturation and thriving. And then changing traumatic stories to resilient narratives. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And resilience is the idea that you're able to bounce back, that you're able to adapt, you're able to change habits, and that you continue to do that with connection and attention to others. And there are several principles that relate to it. Cultivating a belief in your ability, connecting with sources of support, talking about what's going on, being helpful, attitude of survivorship, and so on. And I think what's important in creating stories is remembering that your goal is to widen the resilient zone. And the community resiliency model talks about being bounced out of your zone because of negative experiences, but using them, learning from them, and coming back to a wider zone of resilience. And this is essentially a nervous system reaction to stress. And the resilient zone is coming back to where your parasympathetic nervous system kicks in when you're in a sympathetic mode. So building a resilient story is actually a method. You start at the end. How did you get through the adverse event? When do you remember feeling safer? What were your resiliency elements? What strengths and qualities did you use to get through it? And how did you grow? What meaning did you make of the story? So last story for the day, my experience with COVID, specifically since the topic is COVID, is that my mom passed away from COVID about a year ago. And so that's the end of the story, but the end is actually that I got to be with her on her last moments, and I got to hold her hand, despite restrictions from the hospital, despite being told, go home, you can't come in. And how did I get through it? I actually thought about what aren't my strengths, which is speaking up, which is insisting, or coming to the hospital every day in gear and saying, I must see her, and they finally let me in. So my resilient stories, I got to spend the last day of my mom's life holding her hand, as she did for me when I was a baby. And I want to end with just a quick poem, and this poem is a palindrome. So depends about your narrative. How are you going to read it? So from the top down, it reads like a terrible poem about mistrusting people, and people are naturally unkind, right? But if you read it from the bottom, it's a different narrative altogether. So decide on your narrative. Think about where is your resilience? How are you going to grow it? How are you going to embed it into a personality structure that follows you wherever you go? How do you make meaning of adversity? And please continue to thrive wherever you go. Thank you.